Last summer, I found an old, locked toolbox in the back of my dad's garage while helping clear out some clutter after he moved to a smaller place. Yesterday, my dad called me in a panic, begging me not to open it, right after I'd finally managed to pick the lock. He's never been secretive before, so why the desperate warning now, and what could be so important inside a dusty, forgotten box? I'll tell you everything I discovered, and why my relationship with my family might never be the same again. It started out as just another one of those weekends where you think you're going to be home by noon, but end up with dust in your hair and a sore back instead. My dad had just downsized to a townhouse, and his new garage barely fit his car, let alone 3 decades of might-need-it-someday clutter. So, I volunteered to help sort through the mess, partly because I owed him for all the times he'd bailed me out, and partly because, well, we actually got along, awkward silences and all. I remember stepping into that garage and getting hit by the smell of old motor oil and cedar shavings. Dad was already there, sleeves rolled up, sorting a pile of tangled extension cords. "Glad you made it," he said, giving me a lopsided smile. His hands were already smudged with grease. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, though my voice echoed a little too much in the mostly empty space. There was always this push and pull between us, a real closeness, but also these gaps where words would just kind of fall away. We worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scrape of boxes against the concrete and the occasional clink of tools. The mid-morning sunlight slanted through the grimy window, making dust motes dance in the beams. I started on the back shelves, digging through half-empty paint cans and brittle garden gloves. That's when I saw it, a heavy, battered metal toolbox wedged way behind some old camping gear. The thing looked ancient, the red paint faded to a rusty pink, and a thick padlock sealing it shut. "Hey Dad, what's this?" I called, pulling it out and setting it on the workbench. It thudded down with an unexpected weight. He looked over, and for a second, his whole body seemed to stiffen. "Oh, that old thing," he said, trying for casual, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Yeah, it's locked." "Got the key?" I asked, brushing dust from the lid. My fingers tingled with curiosity. He shook his head, a little too quickly. "Nah, it's just junk. Probably some old screws and nails. You can toss it if you want." He turned away, busying himself with a box of mismatched sockets. Something about the way he said it felt off. I watched him for a moment, and that's when I noticed his hand, a subtle tremor, barely there, as he sorted through his tools. My dad's always been steady, the type to fix a leaky faucet at midnight without so much as a sigh. Seeing him falter, even for a second, sent a weird chill up my spine. "Are you sure?" I pressed, running my hand along the cold metal. "Because it's pretty heavy. Feels like more than nails." He let out a short laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Trust me, nothing good's in there. Just leave it." He changed the subject so fast, asking me about my job, my plans for the weekend, that I almost missed how his voice caught on the word nothing. But I couldn't let it go. I glanced at him, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the tools in his hand, and realized he wasn't just being forgetful. He was hiding something. The kind of something that makes a man's hand shake when he thinks no one's looking. I decided then and there, I wasn't tossing that box. Not yet. There was a story locked inside, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I really wanted to know it. But I had to. And that's where things started to get strange. When I got home that night, the toolbox felt heavier than it had in the garage. Not physically, though it was a solid, battered old thing, but emotionally. I set it on my kitchen table, its dented corners scraping against the wood, and just stared at it. My dad's voice echoed in my head from earlier that day when we'd loaded boxes into my trunk. He'd been so casual then, joking about my pack rat jeans. There was absolutely nothing in his tone to suggest that this one forgotten toolbox would send him into a panic. But now, with the apartment quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and my fridge cycling on and off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this box was a puzzle I was supposed to solve. I ran my fingers over the cool, pitted metal, tracing the nameplate, Fisher, stamped right into the steel, probably from before I was born. The lock was a chunky, old-school padlock, the kind you'd see in a hardware store from the 80s. No key, of course. Dad hadn't handed me one, and I sure hadn't found anything that fit when I'd rummaged through the rest of his stuff. I tried every spare key I owned, even the tiny one from my old bike lock, just in case there was some trick. I could smell the faint scent of oil and dust, mixed with something older, metallic, a tang that lingered on my hands after I touched the box. Nothing worked. The lock just clunked at me, stubborn and cold. It was like the universe was daring me to give up, but the longer I stared, the more I started to wonder, What could possibly be inside this thing that would make my dad, of all people, freak out? I googled how to pick a lock on my phone, propping it up against a coffee mug. There were YouTube tutorials, diagrams, even entire forums devoted to people obsessed with opening locks. I found a bobby pin in my bathroom drawer and bent it into shape, then grabbed a paperclip. The TV played in the background, but I tuned it out, hyper-focused on the feel of the lock, tiny movements, the click of metal against metal, my heart pounding every time I thought I felt it shift. At one point, my neighbor knocked on the wall. I must have been making more noise than I realized. I called out, "Sorry," and went back to work, sweat prickling along my hairline. The apartment smelled like stress and old metal now. It took hours, long enough that my hands started to cramp. I was about to give up when, suddenly, the lock gave a tiny, almost imperceptible click. My breath caught. I twisted the shank, and the padlock popped open with a stubborn snap. I stared at it in disbelief, grinning like a kid who'd just pulled off a magic trick. I'd done it. I actually picked the lock. That's when my phone rang, sharp and jarring against the hush of my apartment. I glanced at the screen, Dad. The timing was so uncanny that I froze, the padlock dangling from my fingers. For a second, I wondered if he somehow knew what I'd just done. I answered. "Hey, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "Did you open it?" His voice was tight, almost frantic. I hesitated, glancing at the box. I just got the lock off. What's going on?" There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, shaky and uneven. "Don't open it. Please," he said. "Just bring it back. Tonight, if you can. Don't look inside." My stomach dropped. "Why? Dad, what's in it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He sounded desperate, almost scared. "It's not for you. You have to trust me on this, okay? Bring it back. Right now." In the silence that followed, I heard a faint sound, maybe the TV at his place, maybe just static on the line. I could picture him sitting in his new, too small living room, hands pressed to his temples. "Dad, you're scaring me. What's in the box?" I pressed. He wouldn't answer. "Just bring it back," he repeated, voice breaking. Then he hung up. I sat there with the open padlock in my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. Everything in me wanted to do what he said. But there was something about his voice, something beyond just embarrassment or regret. It was fear. And if my dad was afraid, I needed to know why. I stared at the box for a long time, the weight of the padlock in my palm. Finally, I set the phone aside and flipped open the lid. Inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell, old paper and something faintly floral, like dried perfume. There was a thick stack of photographs, edges curled and yellowed with age, bundled with a rubber band that had turned brittle and snapped as soon as I picked it up. Beneath that, a folded, faded envelope, its corners soft from being handled too many times. And sitting at the very bottom, a small, ornate key, brass, with a pattern etched into the bow that I didn't recognize. I reached for the photos first. My hand shook a little as I thumbed through them. The first few were of my dad, unmistakably younger, maybe late 20s, his hair longer, smile crooked in a way I'd never seen. His arm was around a woman I didn't recognize. She was laughing, her head thrown back, dark hair spilling over her shoulders. They looked happy. Not just posing for the camera happy. Something deeper. There were shots of them at a lake, sitting on the hood of a car, even one where they were dressed up, maybe for some fancy event. I stared at the woman's face, trying to place her. Was she a family friend from before I was born? An old girlfriend my dad had never mentioned? Something about the way he looked at her made my stomach twist. I tried to imagine my dad that young, that carefree, but it was like looking at a stranger. I set the photos aside, hands tingling, and picked up the envelope. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There was a name written on the front in looping script, Michael. My dad's name. I slid out the single sheet of paper, careful not to tear it. The writing inside was faded, almost smudged, but still legible. "Dear Michael," it began. "I hope you find this when you need it most. I know life has taken us in different directions, but I want you to remember the promise you made. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me. The key is for you, always." There was no signature, just a single initial, R. I read it again, my mind racing. What promise? Who was R? Was this woman still out there, waiting for my dad to show up after all these years? My hands were shaking as I picked up the key, turning it over in my fingers. It was heavier than it looked, cool and smooth, with a tiny number stamped into the side, 113. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the letter and the key, just in case. The apartment felt suddenly colder, like someone had opened a window I couldn't see. I looked at the toolbox, the photos, the letter, and the key all laid out on my kitchen table. My life had felt so normal just hours ago. Now I was staring at a version of my dad I'd never known existed, and a secret that felt too big to carry alone. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the woman's face, my dad's crooked grin, the mysterious R. I kept replaying his voice in my head, that desperate plea not to open the box. Why now? Why after all these years? The next morning, I drove to my dad's new apartment. The city was waking up, sunlight slanting through the trees, birds chattering from somewhere high above. My hands were cold on the steering wheel, the key in my pocket feeling like a stone. I buzzed his apartment, and he let me up without a word. The hallway smelled like coffee and old carpeting, and when I knocked, he opened the door almost immediately. He looked older than I remembered, hair grayer, eyes rimmed red like he hadn't slept. He glanced at the toolbox in my hands, then up at me. "So you opened it," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Dad, what's going on? Who is she?" I asked, holding out the stack of photos, my voice barely above a whisper. He took them with trembling fingers, and for a moment, he just stood there, staring down at the woman in the pictures. His face crumpled, not in anger, but in something like grief. "She was my first love," he said at last, voice thick. "Her name was Rachel." I waited, the breath caught in my throat. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere down the hall. "She gave me that key," he said, glancing at my hand. "It opens a safety deposit box. I haven't seen it since before you were born." I blinked, confused. "Why? What's in it?" He shook his head, sinking down onto the worn sofa. "I made her a promise. Before I met your mother, before any of this. I told her, if things ever changed, I'd come find her. And if I didn't, she said to hold on to the key. Just in case." He looked up at me then, eyes shining. "I loved her. But life, it got complicated. I met your mom, we built a family, and I tried to forget. But I never could. That box, it's a piece of the life I almost had." I sat down next to him, the photos between us, the toolbox heavy on my lap. The room was filled with the soft ticking of the clock and the gentle hum of the fridge. I tried to picture my dad as a young man, torn between two worlds. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" I asked quietly. He looked away. "I wanted to. I didn't want you to think less of me. Or your mother." I swallowed hard. The key pressed into my palm, sharp and real. My dad's secret, Rachel, the promise, the safety deposit box, was suddenly my secret, too. And I realized, sitting there in his apartment, that opening the toolbox hadn't just changed how I saw my dad. It had changed everything about our family. But the biggest secret was still out there, waiting, whatever was inside that box, wherever Rachel was now. I looked at my father, uncertain but determined. "We have to find out what's in that box," I said. He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks. "I know," he whispered. That was the moment I understood, nothing was ever going to be the same. The next morning, the air between my dad and me was heavy with everything unsaid. We barely spoke on the drive to the bank, just the hum of the engine and the faint tap of his fingers against the steering wheel. He looked smaller in the passenger seat, like he'd aged 5 years overnight. My heart pounded as we passed the brick storefronts and pulled into the parking lot, because I knew this was it, the real secret was inside that safety deposit box, not just the battered toolbox or the handful of letters I'd already found. Inside, the bank was chilly and quiet, the kind of place where even whispers feel too loud. The manager led us down a hallway lined with vault doors, and my dad's hand shook as he signed the paperwork. When the heavy door swung open, the metallic scent of cold steel filled the air. My dad reached into the box and pulled out a faded velvet pouch and a thick stack of yellowed envelopes, rubber banded together, edges worn. He held the pouch out to me, eyes shining with something like regret. "Go ahead," he said, voice rough. I opened it, and out slid an old engagement ring, delicate, with a pale blue stone, nothing like the ring my mom wears. My dad closed his eyes for a second. "Her name was Alice," he said quietly. "Before your mother. We were supposed to get married, but she died. There was an accident." I kept everything, her letters, the ring, locked away after I met your mom. I wanted a fresh start, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it all away. The letters had dates spanning 2 years before I was born. I flipped one open, careful not to tear the brittle paper. In Alice's looping script, there were stories about dreams, about the house they would buy, the kids they'd have. It felt like reading a ghost's diary, and I saw my dad's hands tremble as he watched me. "Why did you never tell us?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling. "I was ashamed," he said. "Ashamed that I couldn't let go. I worried that if your mom knew, she'd think she was second choice. I didn't want you kids to think I was living in the past. I tried to bury it, but I guess I never really could." We sat there for a long moment, the only sound the distant were of the vault's air system. I put my hand over his. "You don't have to hide anymore," I said. "Not from me." He squeezed my hand back, tears brimming in his eyes. Back at home, the silence was different. Lighter, but uncertain. We sat at the kitchen table, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, dust mote swirling. I turned the ring over in my palm, feeling its weight. My dad made us both tea, the clink of mugs breaking the stillness. "Do you think you'll tell Mom?" I asked. He stared into his cup. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe she deserves to know who I really am. But I need to find the right way." I nodded, thinking about my siblings, about what this secret might mean for them. Would it change how they saw him? Or would it just add another layer to the complicated, messy love we all have for our parents? That night, as I lay in bed, the toolbox sat on my dresser, empty now except for the space where secrets used to live. I realized I saw my dad differently, not as a stranger, but as someone carrying invisible weights I'd never noticed. Maybe that's what family really is, learning to love each other, not in spite of the secrets, but through them. And maybe, I thought, some boxes are meant to be opened, not to air out the past, but to finally let it rest.